The first person on the panel we're going to bring up is Debbie Weinstein here? Is Debbie Weinstein?
I'm here.
She's there.
Okay. Debbie Weinstein leads the Coalition on Human Needs, the national umbrella group for all organizations and network fighting for low-income people in the healthcare, food, housing, job, and human service fields. NAHT participates in CHN's Save Our All Coalition and via their weekly conference calls to learn about what's going on in Washington and how tenants can fight back. Welcome, Debbie, you have the floor.
Thanks so much. It's been great to listen to everyone, and congratulations to everyone who won awards. What I'm going to talk about is other kinds of advocacy that has paid off so far, but we've got a lot more work to do. So I'm talking about the situation around COVID-19, the legislation that has passed in Congress, and most particularly what still has to pass. And I would just start by saying what a critical time it is. There's a federal moratorium on evictions that's expiring at the end of July. Also expiring the extra $600 per week that people receiving unemployment insurance are getting. Also, most state fiscal years start up on July 1, and their revenues are plummeting, and budgets are passing before Congress has given any assurance that they're going to do something more to help. All of these things affect the services that people with low incomes really care about. And in this context, there's lots of current data that we've been sending out on a weekly basis, and I can put in the chat box links to some of this. But you know, we know that more than half of Latinx and Black households have lost income from work since the middle of March, when the pandemic really kicked in. More than half. We know that in households where somebody did lose work income, close to 1 in 4 weren't able to pay their rent in May. They didn't pay, or they deferred their May rent. That was true of more than a quarter of Black households. We know that more than 1 in 5 Latinx and Black households with children said that they sometimes or often did not have enough to eat in the previous week. Really, you can see I'm not a young kid, and we have not seen data like this, frankly, in my memory. It's severe. If it's a household with children where the adult actually had COVID symptoms, nearly half said that they sometimes or often didn't have enough to eat. So I only mention this in the context, I guess I don't really have to tell you how important it is to our communities, to the economy, that we meet the needs. And we've got people in Congress, some of whom want to help with that, and some need a lot of convincing. So we've got 3 major bills that passed so far. And the first one did include, you know, funding for COVID testing and Medicaid costs. That was pretty modest. Some increase in nutrition assistance. They expanded unemployment benefits and paid leave. So that was the first round. That passed. The second was a much better bill. It was called the CARES Act. And that included more extensive unemployment insurance. There was the big one-time payments, those $1,200 payments that they called economic impact payments that individuals got, with more for families. So that was part of that bill. There was a lot more in that bill. Education assistance, some state and local aid, of small amount, relatively speaking, in housing and homelessness resources. And there was that, what they call the Paycheck Protection Program, which gave money to smaller businesses so that they could keep people on the payroll. So that was what that was. And now, so a lot of money was spent, trillions of dollars was spent, but we still have the need that I was just describing. And the House of Representatives understands that, and they pass a excuse me, something that was called the HEROES Act. That's a $3.5 trillion bill that includes lots of important assistance. And I will say that some of the most important provisions include housing assistance, $100 billion package that would prevent or pay rents for people. We know that these eviction moratoria are coming to an end. And when they do, as you know, rent has been piling up. If people don't get assistance, they're not going to be able to pay the back rent, and they will get evicted once that moratorium is done. So the $100 billion would be extraordinarily important to help them manage. There are other, they would repeat the payments to the individuals at $1,200, make it more generous actually. They would continue that weekly $600 extra in unemployment insurance that otherwise would be expiring at the end of July. They'd increase SNAP benefits as well, which is extraordinarily important. When I mention how many people are not able to put enough food on the table in the previous week, we just have to respond to that. So we have to respond. The House responded, but the Senate has not. And they are about to go on recess at the end of this week. They'll have their 4th of July recess. They won't be back until July 20th. At that time, you know, the Republican leadership in the Senate, at first they just said, well, let's wait and see. But of course, as coronavirus cases have been spiking in so many places, the economy still is terrible. They recognize they have to do something. And they've talked about a fair, relatively speaking, smaller amount of money, an inadequate amount of money to deal with the problems at hand. Even the Trump administration is willing to spend more than the Senate is so far. And right now, the high water mark is the House. So what we're trying to do is encourage people to talk to their senators. This is true of Republicans and Democrats alike. We need to really light a fire under people to take the firmest possible position to push the negotiation so that the needs can be met. So I know you've got a lot of people on the panel, and I'll stop there. But what I'm going to do is put in the chat box a link. I hope I can do this. It's kind of fat, but all you have to do is click on it. And let me see if I can get this back. If you do, it will help you kind of automatically send a email to your senators. And so far, with the help of a lot of different groups, okay, I hope that works. Yeah, it's very big, but if you click anywhere on it, I think you'll be able to get it. We've already had about 90,000 emails to members of the Senate. So we need yours to be lighting a fire under those folks. And then the one additional thing, if I can do it, is I'll leave my email address there. So if people have questions, you can reach me. But thank you very much for what you're doing. You're making a huge difference. We need you. And we've got to light a fire under the Senate so that they do what's necessary so that people don't go from this moratorium to huge numbers of evictions and homelessness, um, you know, you know why that would be just awful. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Weinstein. And thanks for sharing those links. If anyone want to go into the chat box, and you will see those links in the chat box, and they may be useful to you at some time. So the next person I want to introduce is the Reverend Graylin Hagler. He is a lifetime civil rights and anti-racist activist and preacher with the Poor People Campaign based in Washington, D.C. You may remember in 2018 at NAHT's conference, we marched to the Martin Luther King Memorial, and he gave quite a powerful speech there. I'd like to introduce to everyone the Reverend Graylin Hagler. Reverend Hagler.
Well, it's good to be with you today and through this whole virtual reality, because our lives have significantly changed since the end of March. I mean, one of the things that happened, and I'm going to just talk very personally. One thing, I pastor Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ here in Washington, D.C. And of course, with the onslaught of the pandemic and the lockdown, the revenues in the church went to zero. If you think about the impact of that, because people were not used to online presence, they were used to face-to-face, they were used to engaging face-to-face, and so with that pandemic, revenues went to zero, and also at the same time, calls coming into the church from the community went to an all-time record high of people out of food, and you just name it, from utility bills and all of those types of things that people got hit very hard with. And I'll point out this is that I had, since that pandemic began, the lockdown, I've had 20 funerals of people who have died from COVID-19 just in my congregation. I'm not talking about other congregations, just in my congregation. It started from the first week. And so in a sense, you know, we saw exactly how hard, particularly Black communities of color was hit, because what we really began to discover in the sort of the whole economic arrangement was that most of the people, our constituency, if they held on to their jobs, they were not allowed to work remotely because they did not have those kinds of jobs. You had a whole lot of people who were healthcare workers in convalescent homes and in nursing homes, and they got hit hard. And one after another, I was burying them because they had no time off. And in fact, when it all came down, they had no personal protection equipment either. So they were exposed over and over again, which only says, you know, this is a part of the whole systemic racism that exists and the whole kinds of economic disparities. When we did the Poor People's virtual march on Washington, which was on June 20th, this past June 20th, you know, people estimated that well over 1 million people participated in that virtual march. Well, I believe it was well over 1 million people. One, C-SPAN carried it from beginning to end. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival on their website, carried it from beginning to end. You had journalists like Ali Veshi, who carried it on his own homepage, and people like that who kept carrying this whole issue around the Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign focused on a number of things, right? The interlocking evils and injustices of systematic racism, systematic poverty, ecological devastation, war-based economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. Those are the types of things that we have focused upon, and it's all interrelated, because we look at the religious nationalism is afoot because it denies that people are poor. It denies that racism exists. It denies that there is a need for some kind of social infrastructure. It basically takes on a mentality, and it puts forth a mentality that I made it by pulling on my own boots and pulling up my own bootstraps, and you should too. And the issue that they try to put forth is that the issues of poverty is because people are lazy.
That's right.
And so, in a sense, that's what we're faced with this white evangelical movement in this country, that these right-wing politicians basically gravitate towards, is because really this kind of religious nationalism is a protection of the empire and an advancing of the empire's values. And those values are built upon greed, and those values are built upon exploitation. And that value is built upon definitely not sharing with others what someone has too much of, if you know what I'm saying. That's why we always jump into that whole rhetoric of the rich get richer while the poor get poor, right? Because it is not a matter of sharing the resources in a country that is as rich as the United States of America, but it's really about hoarding, and it's really about exploitation and turning everything into a commodity, even down to healthcare, down to housing. Just think, you've turned water into a commodity, right? The fact is when we talk about places in Michigan that the water was so contaminated, and if you were wealthy, you were not exposed to the contaminants in the water. But if you were working class and poor, you had no other alternative. So basically, they made water into a commodity, and everything that we have existing before us that we are relying upon for survival has been turned into a commodity. The types of things that, when you look at, for example, in I'll just point out DC, public housing in DC. Public housing in DC has been deliberately dismantled over the last 4 decades. And the argument is always interesting. The argument is, oh, we got to condemn that public housing because it's unfit to live. When in fact, what has happened is that money was not invested in public housing, and therefore it was a foregone conclusion that it would get to a place because it was not repaired, it was not upkept, it was not a part of the social fabric, not a part of the budget, and so housing became unlivable. I mean, we've watched over and over again, the battle around here is to try to make sure that people can have an ability to return back to the places, the neighborhoods, after the redevelopment happens. And of course, one of the pushes have been, if you're going to develop or redevelop, and the thing that people always talk about is sort of mixed income use, or mixed income use basically puts those that are poor at a real minority, and basically they can't come back because all types of financial structures are put in place to keep people from coming back. So it's those kinds of battles. When we look at the ecology, when we look at the issues around poverty, when we look at the issues around systemic racism, we look at really the issues around war-based economy, the military-industrial complex, as well as the prison-industrial complex. We can't shake off the relationship that each of these things have to the other. And again, who we're struggling against is the same common enemy. Those who are greedy, those who want more, and those who want to make sure that everything of survival is removed from people of color, from poor people. And the issue is that that's why we got to come together. That's what we've been trying to do in the Poor People's Campaign, is to recognize that we got to come together or we will always be used against one another. I always think about that LBJ quote. I don't know if you know about that, but LBJ says if you can convince the dumbest white person that he's better off than the smartest black person, well, he'll give you the money right out of his pocket. Hell, he'll let you pick his pocket. And that's the reality. That's the way white supremacy is set up. It's to feed into people this kind of psychology that keeps them separated and keeps them divided. When the issue is, poor white folks ain't got nothing either. Poor white folks are at the whim of all of these policies that are geared towards wealthy folks. I heard somebody talking earlier about, I think one of the previous panelists was talking about the payroll protection, the payroll protection plan that was put into effect. Well, if you remember, the money was eaten up originally by all the major corporations who had resources, and they just gobbled up the money quickly off the table so that nothing was left for anybody that was small business or struggling. Because that's what, even Harvard got money to put into its endowment that Harvard proudly said it was not going to give back. Which only shows you, again, how the tables are turned, how there is a lack of equity that exists, and how we must break down the walls that separate us as poor and working folks and come together to really challenge the beast. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Hagler.
Thank you
Great.
much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Very, I mean, we much needed words at during this time. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is none other than Rob Robinson. And he is a lifelong activist in the housing and human rights movement in the US around the globe. Rob is based in Partners for Dignity and the Right in New York City, and has been frequently ally and guest at our NAHT conference. Welcome back, Rob. Nice to hear you, and we're looking forward to hear what you have to give us today.
So thank you. Thanks for having me. I look forward to this gathering every year. I want to thank Geraldine Collins and Charlotte Rogers. I live in the same city with them, but I confess every year at the NAHT conference that I only get to see them when we all gather in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
So shame on me, but
on you.
Right. I also want to thank Michael Kane. Michael and I have worked together for a number of years, and my fondest recollection of Michael was being in an intense march in Medellin, Colombia in 2014. And as things were getting heated up and the police were out there with M16s against a group of people on motorcycles who were becoming upset with us, somebody brought Michael over to me and said, here's your friend from Massachusetts. And it just sort of calmed everything down. So I appreciate everybody at NAHT inviting me, and I appreciate the folks behind the scenes. Folks, I do a lot of the Zoom stuff, and I don't know if you know how challenging that job is. So big ups to the people working this conference behind the scenes, and I thank you. Amen. So our first two speakers, or the speakers before me, talked a lot and set the stage about policy issues, advocacy and policy, and a little bit of history from Reverend Hagler. I want to say from the outset that these conditions existed before COVID. Right? I think that's why we're all in the struggle. COVID exacerbated these issues and just sort of floated them to the top. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on the ground and how people are doing advocacy work on the ground around the country, a little bit around the world, and then I'll talk a little bit from the perspective of the UN, because there's some opportunities there. So I'm based in New York, and you heard a lot about moratoriums on evictions. I might argue with some of the folks that said, my city has the strongest eviction moratorium. We had a pretty strong one here in New York, and we started fighting on Friday, March 13th. And by Sunday, March 15th, the chief state judge in New York, we had beat him into submission till he sent us a PDF. Here's the moratorium. Can I get some rest, please? And we started sharing that with folks all over the state, but also I personally took it and shared it with folks around the world. You know, I work in several different countries, Brazil, South Africa, and places like that. So SERI, the Socioeconomic Rights Initiative, took it to the South African government. 2 days later, they're texting me back a PDF of their eviction moratorium. So it just shows how we can collaborate together to make social change. And this is an issue that affects everybody around the world, right? Evictions. So we had this eviction moratorium. It was lasted until June 20th, and then it was extended till August 20th. But the extension is weak, and we're fighting about the extension because it's not clearly as strong as the first eviction moratorium was. And our courts, our evictions in New York are a civil court action. The courts opened up on the 22nd, and we were in front of all of them doing protests. We had people in Queens, we had people in Brooklyn, we had people in Manhattan, we had people in the Bronx. And the chief judge again got beat into submission and extended no court business until at least July 7th, right? So you can open the doors, but there's no transaction of eviction court happening right now in the city courts, downstate at least. But that speaks to a coalition that a lot of the groups in New York are a part of, the upstate, downstate coalition, sharing information, working together. A group that NAHT is pretty familiar with, CASA in the Bronx, is I work a lot with those folks. They are part of it. Flatbush Tenants Coalition, Crown Heights Tenants Union. These are all tenant organizing groups that get on twice weekly calls to figure out tactics and strategies moving forward. Those calls have been very powerful. There's right to counsel in New York City. They fought for the right to counsel in housing court and won that victory in 2018. They are leading this fight now for an eviction moratorium. As I was on with you guys today, they were doing a training, which I missed, on eviction defense, actually surrounding people around their apartments, putting 100 people in an apartment building. You're not going to evict anybody here. Really thinking about how do we challenge the market, the marshals as a community. So that's some of the thinking here. Right to Counsel also produced on a website, and I'll put all of this in the chat once I'm done. I have a document, the worst evictors. We know who they are. We know who finances them, and we make it very public. We shame them. Just before COVID, I was up at Harvard doing a talk with one of the leaders of the legal community and the right to counsel, Marika Diaz, and I mentioned a Brooklyn landlord who's one of our worst evictors. And I believe it was a family member who was at that talk and got very offended that I put that family member's name out in the public, but that's what we do. That's how we're gonna fight for change. These fights are also going on around the country. The Center for Popular Democracy is also organizing on a national level, and People's Action is also organizing on a national level. The ask is the same out of all of these groups. We want rent canceled, we want debt forgiven, and we want utility bills forgiven. We don't want extensions to pay. If I haven't worked for 3 months, I'm not going to be able to make that up because my job isn't one that I'm able to save. I'm living check to check. That's the average person who we're fighting for these victories. So we're demanding that this rent be canceled for the time period. I will say to you all personally, one of the ways I speak to a lot of people, I'm in a position where I can, but I'm taking a stand. I haven't paid rent since April, and I don't intend to until our governor reacts here in New York to make some change. I'm not peeing away the money. I put it in a bank account. I've set it on the side. But the landlord is not getting it until some change is made that benefits the people. And we do that because if enough people do it, and there's a cadre of folks doing it, we will see that change. There are several people on rent strikes. We have about close to 16,000 tenants in New York City on rent strikes that we know are documented from these different coalitions. And eventually that's going to collapse because, as you just heard Reverend Hagler talk about capitalism, that economic model, these landlords work off of greed and profit, and that mill has to keep churning to satisfy them. Remember, profit, I always articulate profit and equate it to a drug. You never satisfy the urge. The more I make, the more I want. So we have to stop that. Eventually, we need to change the economic model that we're living on. That's a long-term goal. So quickly, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to switch to some UN mechanisms we're using to move these issues. So the United States was supposed to go before something called the Universal Periodic Review this past May. That's where the U.S. goes before all of its peers in the UN nation states and answers to social injustice that advocates have been asking about or that other countries have been told exist in the U.S. That has been postponed till November 14th. But in advance of that, some of us, I'm a member, longtime member of the U.S. Human Rights Network, we had prepared a side event that we were going to do actually in Geneva, Switzerland until COVID-19 hit. And then we moved to online. Online, we brought together 44 missions from around the world to hear about social injustice in the U.S., including police killings, the lack of health care, affordable health care for people, the lack of housing, all of these issues. So that's going to encourage these delegates from around the world in November, when they get to question the U.S., ask why. This information gets written into a report. The U.S. has to respond to that report, and then we end up with a tool for our organizing, because they have to make a commitment of how they're going to undo these injustices. So there's a lot of different advocacy going on around the world, around the country, in different states and around the world, but collectively, I think we're all going in the same direction. And that in the United States, that looks like canceling rent, canceling debt, canceling utilities, and just setting us up for, you know, a better situation going forward, because nobody knows when this pandemic is going to end. So the $100 check did not do anything to change anybody's lives substantially. So I'll end there and say thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Rob, for your always useful insights, and we really appreciate you, and we look forward to you coming back again next year. The last speaker will be Glenn Robbins. He's the leader of the Defense Council Housing, NAHT counterpart in the United Kingdom. DCH has been leading the fight against privatization of the UK's public housing system, known as council housing, and wrote There's No Place, a book about US tenant movement, including NAHT. Glenn has been a welcome guest at most NAHT conferences for a decade. And Glenn has a couple of us in his book. I think Charlotte Delgado is in that book. Myself, and also Charlotte Rogers is included in that book, and maybe some other people that has been with NAHT for a while is included in that book. But Glenn, we're going to give the floor to you.
Thanks a lot, Geraldine. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yeah, it's 2 decades, actually, more than 2, in fact. I've been coming to NAHT conference since the last century. So it's great to be with you. And at the same time, there's something wrong. You know, I feel very much as though I should be in DC or nearby with you all. But I suppose what that tells us is that these are extraordinary times, and we've been through a lot together, if you will, over the last decades, but nothing quite like this. And Rob was just referring to the United Nations, and I just wanted to start with a recent quote from the UN Special Rapporteur, who said that housing has become the front-line defense against coronavirus. Home has rarely been more of a life or death situation. And I think that really does sum up the importance of the situation we're in, some of which was also described beautifully by some of the people talking about their struggles locally and receiving awards. And we know the impact that the virus is having on working class communities.
Oh, yes.
And then, of course, we witnessed the lynching of George Floyd. And I think it's for us to join the dots between these issues. The poisonous link between housing and racism is something that is profound, not just in the United States, but across the world. And another friend of NAHT, Diane Yentl from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, put it very well, I think. She said recently, there's a direct line that connects America's history of racist housing policies to today's over-policing and disinvestment in Black and brown communities. So I suppose that's the situation we're in, and the real question is, what do we do about it? And from the point of view of Defend Council Housing, and I hope I can persuade you on this as well, all roads really lead to a revival of public housing. Our Prime Minister is due to make an announcement tomorrow, we're told, and the headline is build, build, build. Now, we don't know what he's going to build. Based on previous experience, he's probably going to be building more profits for his friends. But we think this is a vital moment to learn some lessons from the past and actually gain some inspiration from what we've done before. And so just a quick historical overview, and in particular, some examples from how we have recovered from this type of crisis before as a society. And so we can do it again. In Vienna, the capital of Austria, between 1925 and 1934, on the back of a pandemic, the tuberculosis pandemic, 60,000 public housing units were built in that decade, in that 9-year, 10-year period, most of which are still standing in excellent condition. I know Michael has had an opportunity to see some of them, I have as well. And they've left a legacy, because in Vienna today, around 60% of the population live in some form of state or public subsidized housing. Now, it would be a stretch to refer to New York City as red in the 1930s, but in 1935, First Houses was opened. It's the first, arguably, public housing development in the US. And I know that Techwood Homes in Atlanta rivals that, so I don't want to get into that controversy. But at the opening ceremony in 1935, Harry Hopkins, who was FDR's advisor, said something that I think rings down the years and across the seas. He said, "Private capital has never spent a dime to build a house for a poor person." And that was true then, and it's true today. And of course, New York City has a legacy of public housing that again survives, a bit like Vienna. 400,000, at least 400,000 people live in public housing in New York City, in 178,684 apartments. And I think anybody who's been to New York City, leave alone those of you who live there, would agree, I think, that it really is public housing that makes New York City the city that it is. When you talk about the diversity of New York City, partly what you're talking about is the significant layer of genuinely affordable homes that create the kind of diversity and vibrancy that New York City has. And again, this was a legacy from the New Deal, partly. During the New Deal, between 1939 and 1943, the US built 160,000 homes, 160,000 units of public housing. And the Reverend Hagler has referred to, and is quite right, the way that public housing, not just in the US, but everywhere, has been denigrated and marginalized for decades. But again, we want to see a revival of public housing because it works, and it works here in the UK. Between 1949 and 1952, again, after a crisis, the crisis of the Second World War, in this country, in Britain, 860,870, so nearly 900,000 homes were built in those 3 years. And of those, 82% were built by public authorities, where it was public housing, mass public housing. And for the 4 decades after, in this country, we always built at least 100,000, what we call council homes, a year. And we didn't have a housing problem. I wouldn't want to portray it as a utopia, but for the bulk of that period, people in this country could have a place to live. And it's not too much to ask, is it? So we want to get public housing, council housing back on the agenda. And I think it is approaching that position. And I've seen the Green New Deal and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders talking about public housing in a way that really has been inconceivable for many years. And so I just want to finish by giving you 10 good reasons why we need public housing. 1, because it is truly affordable, genuinely affordable for people on low and even moderate incomes. 2, the reason it's affordable is because it's not built for profit. It's not built for the likes of Donald Trump and his friends to make money out of. It's there to provide decent homes. 3, it also has security. It allows people to plan for their lives without the constant threat of eviction. And we need that now more than ever, particularly bear in mind what the previous speakers have referred to. 4, it can be energy efficient. We need to utilize the collective strength of public housing to improve not just the homes we already have, but build new homes that are really energy efficient. The market cannot do that. It will not do it. And we have to do it ourselves through genuinely accountable public agencies. 5, we need, and particularly resident in the US, I think, we need comprehensive repairs, we need maintenance, and we need caretaking services that provide the level of environment that working class people are entitled to. And 6, what all of that does is create jobs, and we're going to need thousands, if not millions of jobs, not just in the US, but across the world. And rebuilding council housing and public housing would be a way to rebuild our economy. 7, this is all good value for money. They always say, oh, there's no money. Well, the previous speakers have already attested to the fact that, you know, if we can spend millions of pounds at Harvard, we can spend billions of pounds on public housing and council housing. And it's a good investment. You know, at the moment, interest rates are near zero. Our government should be borrowing money to invest in our communities in public housing. And 8, because public housing and council housing helps to build and sustain communities, because you don't have that constant churn, you don't have that constant anxiety. People can build their lives in public housing, in council housing. And number 9, and again, never a more important time to say this, because that kind of housing is good for people's health. The private market, private renting, Rachmanism, slumlords, that is bad for people's health. We know that. That's why we're seeing a disproportionate impact of COVID on working class communities. So we need to build public housing because it's good for our health. And then finally, number 10, because public housing is democratically controlled by us. You can't control what you don't own. And we need to have ownership of our homes. So I'm going to finish there. I think others have said it, but I'm going to add my own thought. You know, we are in for the fight of our lives. I know NAHT is very good at fighting. That's part of the reason I come back every year. I always learn something. But we're in for the fight of our lives. I don't think we should have any illusions about that. But one of the many great slogans I've learned from NAHT over the years is that when we fight, we win. So thanks very much for having me. And I'll see you next year in DC or wherever we happen to be. Thanks very much, and solidarity.
Right. When we fight, we win.
We win.
When we fight,
we win.
When we fight,
win.
We win. When we Zoom,
we're a little slow.
We get confused.
That was great. Thank you, guys. And I think Debbie's still on too. So thank you all. This was great.